Well, welcome everybody to Shop Talk at Valize, where we have our partner Ron Boire, who's going to share with us some of his experiences with launching products at Sony, and particularly ones that didn't go so well.
Just good morning. It's great to be here. Rita and I are really excited to be having this conversation. This topic came out of a little LinkedIn post that I did a few weeks ago, and frankly came out of our mutual experience as we're launching Valize, which is a consulting business that Rita founded. We run into these situations all the time where you're in a company and a really bad idea just keeps going and going. And one of the books that Rita wrote many years ago, Discover Driven Growth, covers a lot of ground on how to look at these projects and evaluate, do we grow, do we redirect, or do we kill? My personal experience at Sony, and I think some old Sony folks are going to join this video, so it'll be interesting to see what pops up in chat. Had many of these cases. Some of them became great products and some of them did not. So we're going to talk about one that did not today.
Right. And the thought is that we'll have Ron present for maybe 25 minutes or so. And then the rest of the time is really for Q&A and conversation. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. I learned things I never knew before about it. So that's going to be great.
So topic is, why is it so hard to kill a bad idea? And I thought we'd use something from my personal experience. And many of the people on video will enjoy a lot of the historical context here. We've been teasing some of our staffers today about their lack of knowledge about what a compact disc might be or what MiniDisc is, but I'm sure a lot of you will know. A little bit of background about me. I grew up at Sony. I was there for 17 years, eventually president of the audio group, as well as president of distribution. I then went over to the darker side of retail and joined Best Buy, and had a great time there working at Best Buy. And then I've done some private equity deals, with Bain, KKR, Winchurch. I've been a CEO and an advisor. And a lot of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with Rita McGrath. She's a best-selling author. She's a highly sought-after speaker, and she's been a professor at Columbia for a very long time. We've worked together for a couple of decades now. She is one of the leading experts on innovation and growth, especially during times of uncertainty, which makes the pandemic like kind of the convergence of really amazing things for her strategies. She's received the #1 achievement award for strategy from Thinkers 50. Is consistently named one of the world's top 10 management thinkers. So I think of her as the big brain, and I drive the car. But we're working together on Valize and building out her business, where we're going to get some of her ideas out into the wild. So what Valize does, just to give you a little context, we'll get into the case. One thing is really around thought leadership, and that's Rita does a lot of work in this space, and I'll do a little bit of blogging here and there, but she's published a number of best-selling business books, most recently Seeing Around Corners, which will come out in paperback this fall in September. So another chance to pick it up. She's been published dozens of times in places like Harvard Business Review, and publishes Thought Sparks, a strategy newsletter. So a lot on thought leadership. We work on big problems. We work in advisor situations to boards, CEOs, C-suite, and on very complex issues across industries, because strategy is not industry specific. We work on strategy development and leadership coaching and development. We also provide point solutions. One is called Spark Hub, which takes Rita's discovery-driven growth process and builds it into a automated computer process that can help guide companies through the decision process. Innovation Mastery Scale, a team effectiveness tool, and we're building out a fantastic learning system which will complement all of these things. That'll be online and complement some of the strategy work we're doing. So more about that later, but that's what Valize is working on, and it's a lot of fun. So we all think about strategy as about being choices, and I know in my career the most powerful word has always been no. It's also sometimes the hardest word. to say, but strategy is clearly about what you say yes to, and I think sometimes more importantly, what you say no to. And of course, great strategy is about interrelations between strategies and how they work and complement themselves together. And that's part of the theme here with MD, is how they did or didn't work together. So we're going to talk about the Sony MD case. First of all, who's Sony? Sony, at the time that MD was launched, which in 1992, was the company that could really do no wrong. They were a $34 billion company at the time. They literally invented the video recording business. And I was explaining to Flaminia this morning that the reason that she can record on her phone is because the good folks at Sony went to the Supreme Court and got everybody in the world the right to record TV programs. And before Sony, you couldn't do that. Right. They invented the Trinitron TV, which was the industry standard for decades in high quality television. The reason you have headphones on your head is because of Sony. They invented the personal headphone, and because of the Walkman, the compact disc player, PlayStation, digital cameras. So most people in the world have a Sony chip in their digital camera, even today. They invented the DVD. And then what we're going to talk about today is the MiniDisc. So they're famous for what they did really, really well, but also somewhat famous for some of the things that didn't go well, Betamax being one of them and MiniDisc being another. So I love these quotes. These are two of the most brilliant innovators, founders in the world, and how they think about product. And so the first one I'll read it to you is like, you've got to start with the customer experience and work your way back to the technology. You can't start with the technology and try to figure out where you're going to sell it. Quote number one from brilliant founder strategist. Quote number two, we don't ask customers what they want. They don't know. Instead, we apply our brain power to what they need and will want and make sure they're ready. The first one is Steve Jobs, and the second one is Akio Morita. Two brilliant founders, two people that have changed all of our lives, and two completely different views of the world. So how can this possibly be? So we're going to think about these two statements as we talk about the MiniDisc case. By the way, you can find me on LinkedIn, and the MD blog that I put up that is the basis for this case is up there. There's some interesting inside baseball there about some of my favorite people at Sony over the years. So what is or was MD or MiniDisc? MiniDisc was a portable device that records 74 minutes of digital audio, which just happens to be the same length as a compact disc. And it was introduced in the fall of 1992. And those of you on the video, which is, let's say more than half of you remember 1992. And we'll talk a little bit about what was going on in music and the digital space then. But it's not coincidental that it recorded 74 minutes of music. So what was the problem Sony was trying to solve? Rita talks frequently about one of her favorite idioms and strategy is, what is the job to be done? What is the problem we're trying to solve? And the problem that Sony was trying to solve with the MiniDisc was to record a compact disc. It's not coincidental that the MD was 74 minutes and a compact disc maximum length was 74 minutes. So you might say, well, then what's the big issue if this thing can record 74 minutes? The big issue is MD could not legally record compact discs. So here you've created a product that is fundamentally illegal, and you might be scratching your head as I am now and saying, how could that happen? Like, what does that even mean that you produce this product? So this is one of our favorite charts, and it really is illustrative of what every CEO, every head of strategy, every business unit head is faced with when they think about their future strategy and their current business. So remember back in the beginning, I said Sony's business was $34 billion in 1993. All of that business was in music content, current devices, etc. And none of that business was in digital content. Zero. MiniDisc was a toe in the water to try to figure out that business, but if you think about what was happening in the boardroom and the different business unit heads around Sony at the time, all of these people on the left, the elephants, were looking at the mouse at the right and saying, you can't destroy my compact disc business because you want to make a recording. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So this is a chart that shows, I love this chart. It shows the music industry from 1990 to 2016. And I'll just point out a few things here. On the left side of the chart, if you look at 1992, when the MiniDisc was launched, the CD business was 4.3 business. The recorded cassette business, now talk about arcane, that was, you guys remember compact cassettes, it went into a Walkman or a boombox, was a $3 billion business. So call it an $8 billion music industry. But it was being disrupted by this young kid who was probably still in his mom's basement at the time that launched a website called mp3.com and was downloading free music. And the industry was terrified of digital and this free content. And into this environment came MiniDisc, which made great recordings, 74 minutes long. And if you go forward, I'll come back to this chart probably in a bit, but you go forward several years and you can see in the bottom in 2000, way out here. So it took almost 10 years for the RIAA to win their lawsuit against mp3.com and get them to literally stop giving away music. But it wasn't until 2004 with iTunes that the first digital downloads were made. So here's in a nutshell, the problem that Sony and others are trying to solve is like you see this digital wave coming, but how do you place those bets and what's the timing of those bets? So I'll talk a little bit about how to kind of think through that. There are three major phases to strategy. There's ideation, which is like, how do I think about the future? What are the things that might be coming? Then there's incubation, which is kind of like, how do we test those things? And am I jumping into the deep end of the pool, or am I just putting my toe in the water? And how would I know incrementally or big bang whether or not a product is going to actually work? And then acceleration once we know we have a product. Going back to Mr. Job and Mr. Morita, the reason I think those statements are both true and strategically correct is in the ideation phase, it is true that most people can't imagine the future. And let me give you one really quick example. When I was at Sony, one of the projects I worked on was the future of digital connected television. And we spent hundreds of thousands of dollars doing market surveys in one-on-one customer interviews, in focus groups, in direct research, asking people, and this is around 2000, what would you like your digital television to do? And quite literally, in almost every focus group, the number one thing they wanted their TV to do was to pause the television while they went to the kitchen or the bathroom. Now in 2000, there was a product called TiVo that did exactly that. So literally at one point in one focus group in Chicago, I went up and tapped on the glass and said to the moderator, could you please tell them what they're describing is called TiVo? So the ability to imagine a connected future is not in someone's mind. So Morita was, of course, right. Jobs is also right in that he wanted to understand what customers really wanted. He had a different perspective on that, which is what they really wanted is access to my stuff, my place, my time. And that's ultimately what Apple did. Now, how they did it was more into the incubation kind of process, which is really where Sony failed. Because basically they built MD, they launched it into the market, it was fantastically expensive, and it didn't allow customers to legally do what they wanted them to do. Yet they launched it. So from a strategic standpoint, what was really happening here? So every decision that you make as a manager has a present value and it has an option value. So what does that mean? So the present value is the elephant in the room. So it's Sony's existing music business, it's their existing Walkman business, it's their existing television business. The option value is the call, if you will, on the activity that will be driving the business in the future. So if you think about 1992, all of Sony's value was locked up in the compact disc, in Walkmans and Trinitrons and Betamax, whatever they may have been, and none of it was in digital music. So the hard part is, how do you go down this, how do you migrate, how do you walk this path from kind of low uncertainty to high uncertainty and transitioning your business? Because by 2009, basically the CD was dead and digital content had taken over the world. So while it's true that both Apple and Sony, Jobs and Morita saw this coming, one got it right and one got it tragically wrong. And the results are what you see today. Apple, the most, like, maybe depending on the stock price, might be the most valuable company in the world today. Sony's still extremely valuable and extremely profitable. Their business has almost completely transitioned to a content business. And I can tell you in 1992, that was not the strategy. They didn't say, hey, in 20 years, we're going to be a content company. They still wanted to be an electronics company that also had content. So what to do? Like, what do I do about this? And this is where Rita is the real expert. So I'll be more of a John Madden here. Maybe she'll be Pat Summerall. But, one of the things that Rita has introduced in her seminal book, Discovery-Driven Growth, is this idea of an activity portfolio. And every company has things that they do based on market uncertainty and technological uncertainty to grow their business. And so in the case of MiniDisc, the technological uncertainty was, how are we going to legally deliver digital music? And the market uncertainty is, do people really want it? Well, we knew in 1992 that people wanted it for free because they were downloading millions of songs from mp3.com for free, but what would they pay for it? And in the middle of this, Sony dropped MiniDisc, which frankly didn't do either one of these very well. It couldn't deliver digital music, and it was really expensive. So you say to yourself, well, how do you get to this position? How do you get to a position where you've spent all this money and launched a $500 product that doesn't actually do what people want it to do? There's a process, there's a way to kind of think through this. And I'll step through this, and I think Rita will kind of jump in and comment on this. But if you think about your portfolio as covering many aspects of your business, your growth, your core business is that elephant, right? So, in your core, a great example is digitizing a customer portfolio or adding features to a website. It's kind of the optimization zone. And this is where you get, private equity firms do this all the time. If I can get 2% growth out of my core and I could do X and Y, my valuation becomes whatever. On the fringes of this is what we call platform scouting, scouting and positioning. Positioning is really where, there's technological uncertainty, but you're putting initiatives behind to create kind of an initiative, an ecosystem that might be favorable for the product that you're chasing. This might be, Rita's best example, or an example that she uses here all the time, is called Adobe's Creative Cloud. On the platform scouting side is, you can do something. And I love I'll let Rita talk about Amazon Web Services, but I love the Amazon Web Services example. It's an example of, I know how to do something really, really well. I'm doing it for my business. Is there a market for that? And Rita, I don't know if you want to comment on how that came about, but it's a great
couple of things about this platform space is you can't be timid here and succeed. And I think that's something a lot of companies get wrong. It's like they get the right instinct, but then it comes time to, put the budget down, allocate the people, allocate the talent, and they get frightened. And the reason that's problematic is because these are candidates to be your next generation core. And, imagine going to, trying to sell Amazon Web Services, and the customer says, okay, you want me to put my tech infrastructure on your platform. What evidence do I have that you're going to be here in 18 months? And you say, well, actually, we're not sure. I mean, that's not going to fly. So one of the things I think companies often get wrong, and I know there are some examples of this that we've been working on, Ron, are you get to this stage where you're ready to launch, and then you do it too timidly. And I think by the time you're at that stage where you think you've cracked most of the technical problems and you think you've got most of the sort of customer issues sorted out, then you'd really need to go. And that's a moment that requires courage.
So the next phase out is positioning options. And this is where somebody wants something, but you don't quite know how you're going to do it. And Zoom's a kind of a great example of that. And Rita and I were just talking, going way back into the 90s. I remember being at Sony and these video conferencing systems being developed. And back then they were boardroom systems. So, Sony and other companies would go into a boardroom and develop a system for $100,000, $200,000, $500,000. And the justification for this was, well, we're simply going to eliminate 10% of our travel. So we'll spend $500,000, but we'll save $10 million. Well, those things, they just never worked. The technology didn't really work. You didn't have them in all the right places. They're really expensive. So an example in today's world is all of us have become so accustomed to Zoom. Whatever happens after Zoom, right? So what is the next? So it was $500,000. Now it's $14.95 a month. What is the next thing? Is it virtual reality? Is it immersive? What happens?
Holograms. So one other point on positioning options, Ron, that I think people often forget is once you're in this high uncertainty space, this really is the world of options. And what you want as an option, because it's a small investment you're taking today that buys you the right to make a bigger investment down the road. So these really are small things. They're reversible things. They're stoppable things. They haven't yet picked up this sort of tectonic force. And it's important to remember you may want 5 or 10 or 20 different takes on a particular area. And this is what they do superlatively well at Amazon. They'll have what they call 2 pizza teams, and the 2 pizza teams might be tackling a problem. Let's say it's how do I get payments to process 50 seconds faster? And you might have 10, 12, 30 takes on this. And what Jeff Bezos is very well known for saying is, I'd rather have my money spent that way. I'd rather have more variety and fewer permissions so that I can get as much experimentation going as I possibly can. So I think what often happens with options in companies is people say, well, I've got this 3D printing thing, and they appoint a 3D printing czar, right? And that czar is in control of all the 3D printing resources. Well, guess what? Your variety of options has just collapsed to one. And I think that's a very common mistake.
The next set of options are scouting, which is where you can do something. Viral Bank's a great example of this, and I think Rita's been involved in a lot of discussions there. And the idea is we have the tech. Will anybody kind of accept the technology? And I think you've got a great story about.
Oh, sure, about Viral Bank.
Some of the things they tested.
Oh, yeah.
You want to share that?
Yeah, sure. So Viral Bank is this mobile only bank. Their target market is income secure but cash flow challenged millennials. That's how their CEO Colin Walsh talks about them. And so these are people that are they're employed, they've got money coming in the door, but they haven't built up much wealth yet. So it's a wedding, it's a car repair, it's an apartment down payment, and all of a sudden they're in a cash flow crunch, and the traditional solutions banks are offering them is incredibly expensive credit, or they put it on their credit cards. So Vero's whole mission is to help them build up wealth and get rid of that problem. But it's a branchless bank. You do everything on your phone, and the process, the experience is mediated by this chatbot named Val. And so pretty early in the design discussions came the question of, well, we're designing a chatbot, it's got to have a personality, right? And so what kind of personality should Val have? And the design team very rapidly broke into 2 warring camps. And the first camp was, oh, Val should be, these are millennials, right? They're crazy. So Val should be like, hey, dude, tough weekend. Don't worry, got your back, emoji, right? Like very informal. The other camp was horrified by this. They said, wait a minute, no, we really believe this is your money. This is serious. You need Mr. Robertson. I would like to draw to your attention the following things. Here's my recommendation, whatever it is, but one very casual, one very formal. Now, here's the thing. In many organizations, you come to a moment like that and people get so invested in being right? So the hey dude guys are like, this is the right answer, Mr. Robertson. And let me point out, you have no facts. You have like zero data at this stage in the process. So what do we recommend you do with a scouting option? What you really need to do is design an experiment. So what did we do? We got a couple of interns. We put them in a closet. One got to play the Hey Dude guy. The other one got to play Mr. Robertson. We had a developer mock up some screens, and the interns responded as though they were the chatbot. We lured representatives of our target market into the conference room with promises of free pizza, and we let them go. We said, okay, imagine that this is your bank and you're doing business with them. And we got some really great experimental data. And it turns out they hated the Hey Dude guy. It's like, Hey Dude is okay for Venmo when it's beers with my buds, but if it's my life savings, no, I want to be treated very seriously. And so we learned something. Now, here's another point that's important about scouting options is the Hey Dude guys were not correct in this particular case based on the experiment that we did. They failed. They were wrong. It's fine. The whole thing cost us, maybe $500 to learn what wasn't going to work so that we could really focus on what was. So I think having this experimental mindset frees you up from these crazy, I don't know how many you've been in your life, Ron, but the amount of times I've seen people arguing about who's right in a fact-free environment is just stunning to me.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a sport in most companies.
Yeah.
And then, oops.
You want me to talk about the next one?
Yeah, stepping stones.
Sure.
And finally, stepping stones is the stuff that's kind of way out there. And I would argue that categorically, this is where MiniDisc and all digital music and content delivery was, in 1992. Mm-hmm. But the nature of both the music industry as well as the electronics industry didn't allow for experimentation. And something that we should put a link in the Q&A, but there was an initiative called the Secure Digital Music Initiative, SDMI. And I was painfully pulled into this as an electronics representative for many, many meetings over a period of years, which basically was the music industry saying, we're going to put this digital wrapper around every piece of music in the world. And the only way you're going to be able to buy music is through this incredibly complex system. Well, that might have been an idea, but let's say it was one idea. What the industry really needed was 100 ideas like that. Maybe 100 better ideas. And those categorically would be what I would call stepping stones. And the issue with MiniDisc is, I believe personally, that it was one of what many stepping stone experiments should have been that frankly was launched as a thing. Here's a platform. We're going to market with MiniDisc because we're Sony and we've invented this amazing thing. So ideally, what you end up with is something like this. Again, our 3,000 pound mouse balances out the future. So at this point, I'd like to open it up to a little bit of Q&A, and we want to go to the chats. You want me to stop sharing here, Rita? I think.
Yeah, probably.
Well, let's do that.
Great. Okay. So our friend Frank wants to know how we've defined customer experience.
Wow. Customer experience are the things that actually impact an activity. So for example, in a restaurant, the customer experience is everything from the parking lot to the way the busser picks up your plate. So I think one of the things that Rita's done very, very well, and maybe in a future seminar, we can go really deep on Spark Hub as an example. Rita. So Spark Hub is based on this really great book called Discovery Driven Growth, which walks you through all of these, all of the foundational ideas that we just walked through, and how do you test through each one of these. So for example, if you're in the digital music space and you wanted to define the customer experience, how would you do that? There's probably a whole bunch of little things you would do to put in front of customers and to test in the marketplace. So you may have an assumption that, like the SDMI folks had, that a great customer experience would be to put a digital wrapper around it with 32-bit encryption that won't allow you to share a song to your spouse. That's one of the things they did. If you don't own it, you can't share it, you can't play it. So you could buy a song for whatever they wanted to sell a song for, but you can't share it with your family. And frankly, just as a sidebar, one of the reasons Apple won is that Steve wasn't in the music industry. he was respected in the industry. He was well known. He had, Bono was his buddy, all of these things. But at the end of the day, he said, listen, I'm going to sell songs for $1. And if we went back to that.
Yeah, Ron, why don't you put up that slide again? Because I think it really
reveals.
I
want to share something here. So one of the things that I didn't talk about, I'll go back up to that slide. It's going to take me a second to get to my industry slide. But this is a fascinating slide to me. And what this shows, a whole bunch, there's a lot going on here, obviously, but one of the things that, as it relates to customer experience, you see this giant bubble, call it 1999, 2000, where the CD album industry was $12.8 billion. Now think about this. I was explaining to Flaminia this morning that when I was a kid, we had 78s and, you had an A side and a B side to your record. And a mortal sin in the record industry would be to put a good song on the B side, because you basically only want to sell one song. And every once in a while, you'd have a hit record that came from the B side of a record. Some of you may remember that. What you're saying, well, what are you talking about, Ron? In here, all of this blue space in 1999 represents CDs that had somewhere between 10 and 14 songs, not more than 74 minutes. Of those 10 to 14 songs, how many of them did you really want to hear? With very few exceptions, it was one or two. So the CD industry, the music industry, what they were terrified of actually really happened. They were selling a CD with one good song on it, or two good songs on it, desirable, I'll say, and 10 songs that you never listen to again. And that created all this revenue because CDs wholesaled for about $15.50 to $16.50 a piece. Best Buy would happily sell them for $13 or $14.99 on Tuesdays. And the industry was really, really happy, and you got your one good song. Well, when you come over here and you really get into the download business or even the streaming business, you see the real demand for the music. So when Steve Jobs in 2004 said, I'm going to sell a song for $1, what he was selling was, you don't need to spend $15 to get the one song. You only have to spend $1. So the real customer experience, what people were really looking for is, give me the what we used to say at Best Buy, my stuff, my place, my time. Give me my music the way I want it, when I want it. And that's what he solved for here. He didn't solve for, do I want it on a 74-minute magneto optical recording device that has 5 hours of playing time, battery life. It was, how do I get that one song? And you think about we talked about this earlier, Rita and I did, the very few exceptions to this is, Michael Jackson would put out a CD that there was 10 great songs on. And you think about how many artists can you name that do that? The Eagles, okay, Michael Jackson. I'm running out of names already, right? But that was the nature of the industry. And that's really what was driving the industry and why they were so terrified of what was eventually going to happen. And in fact, did happen. So you see now in 2016, I don't have this chart through the last couple of years, but you're down to about a $6 or $7 billion industry from an industry that was about 14 billion in 2000. It's a totally different industry now.
Yeah, very,
very because consumers got what they really wanted.
Yeah. Could I also add on to that, Ron, the ecosystem implications are really important here, because if you looked at that chart, you saw digital downloads really kicking off in 2004. The iPod was introduced in 2001. And we've all forgotten this now, because when it was first introduced, it only worked with Apple's ecosystem. It only worked with about 3% of all the computers on the planet. And the way Jobs was thinking about it at the time was that he said, that's going to be a way for people to create more demand for Macs. And I'm blanking on the guy that it was like the father, Tony Fadell. And Tony Fadell was arguing with him. And he said, no, what you're effectively doing is you're making the iPod cost $4,000, because to use it, a user has to buy this other Mac machine. And they had this huge battle. As you saw from the chart, it went on for years. And finally, Jobs, they behind the scenes, they built the capacity to work on Windows machines. And when the story was told later, Fadell said, we got to do this. We're we're very popular with the 3% of the market that has Apple machines. But in the years that Steve Jobs had been gone, right, the Windows hegemony had really taken over the PC business. This was after Steve Jobs came back, after Apple nearly went bankrupt. And finally, I'm told that Jobs said, okay, ask Mossberg, who's at the time was the tech reporter for the Wall Street Journal. And if Mossberg says it's a good idea, we'll do it. Otherwise, no. And they ran it by Mossberg, who said, yeah, it's a fine idea. The experience is fine. What Jobs was worried about was that those crappy Windows machines would mess up his beautiful, seamless experience. And they were able to invent around it. But I think that's also a really interesting story, because had he prevailed, right, the iPod could have gone the way of the MiniDisc. It could have been supplanted by somebody else inventing something that probably wouldn't have been as elegant or as beautiful, but it would have worked with Windows. And so it would have had network effects on its side.
Yeah, what was market dominant in 1998 and 99 was a product called Rio, which was basically a hard drive that you dumped MP3s on. It was ugly and clunky and had poor battery life. And, I know the folks at Sony were ripping their hair out trying to figure out why would anyone buy this horribly designed, ugly product. Eventually went away when the more elegant things, iPod namely, came along, which were multiples more expensive than the Rio. I mean, the Rio at the end was a $90 item against a $400 iPod.
Well, and remember Microsoft?
Oh,
I mean, this is another fascinating story from history. Both Jobs and Bill Gates saw this idea of the connected home, and Jobs actually saw it as returning the PC to relevance, basically, because at the time, all these distributed devices like video cameras and stuff like that, they didn't have much storage space and they were really clunky. And so you could use the hard drive on your computer to do things in the infancy of the internet as we know it. And so he saw that as a way of resurging the computer. Gates saw the same thing, was quoted at the same time as saying, yeah, every home's going to have digital devices, everything's going to be digital. But when Jobs was able to kind of create the central vision at Apple so that they actually executed against it, and Gates's internally warring culture would not allow one division to sort of outshine another. And so they introduced all these things, but they never really took off, and they never really created that complete user experience that was so important.
So let's go to another question here. I got to thank you for Rita letting you think in refreshing ways. I thank her every day for that. Next question was, there's the discovery. To what extent do the two pizza teams compete with each other? And you were giving the two pizza example at Amazon. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think they're competitive in the sense that everybody wants to find the right answer. But the way that they've set up their culture at Amazon, it's actually expected that you go out and try a lot of stuff. It's not a failure if it doesn't work out and it's not exposed to customers. Where they get more concerned is if you try something, a customer encounters it and it has a bad experience. And so I would say they're not internally competitive in that way. They're more, it's more friendly competition is the way I would frame it. But I think part of that is the culture, right? That it is okay to have 15 different attempts on a music player or, a connected device or a 3D printed whatever. It's fine to do that at that company, because what matters to Amazon is, does Amazon win? Not does this team or that team or the other thing win. And it's a very unusual culture. They're very, what I would describe as mature on our innovation maturity scale, in that if somebody has an idea, there is a whole system for getting resources to look at it, assembling a small team, figuring out what talents that you need. And it happens very fast. They're very fast. So I think they're unusual in that way. Many companies get it wrong because they create these false internally competitive conditions. So we've got one right now that we're working with where there's a set of executives. They're all aspiring to get the next job, the next promotion. A bunch of their comp is depending on their personal performance. And so you're creating this incredible disincentive for them to cooperate. And so if you have that, you're not going to get these cross-divisional, horizontally inspired ideas. And Ron, that was a big problem at Sony, I know, because you had the music guys that were getting compensated one way and the hardware guys that were getting compensated another way. And I remember reading an article at the time that talked about the civil war inside Sony, that it was that bad.
Yeah, Ide used to complain that he couldn't get his lieutenants to listen to him. Publicly complain about it when he was chairman and CEO. I was in a meeting in 1997 in Century City in LA, where we had our dealer council, and we had Walmart was there, Best Buy was there, Target was there, Circuit City was there at the time, and some independent dealers were there. And the discussion from the dealers at that time, the customers at that time, was there's this emerging technology that's called flat panel televisions. It's 1997. And we think these things are really, really cool and they're going to be the future. And on the Sony side was Ide and the head of the TV group and the head of the audio group. And it was, obviously we had these multi-billion-dollar customers there. And the response from the head of the TV group was, we're not going to build that because we make too much money on Trinitron. And I'm paraphrasing, but that was his argument. And it's fantastically profitable and it's better technology because a 30-inch flat screen at that time was $10,000. And that's not where we're going to go. And Ide was actually arguing with the head of television. It was I remember saying to some of my customers, this is kind of an embarrassing conversation, but those were the kind of things that would happen inside of a company of that size. And that's kind of in the electronics group. Forget about the electronics group competing with music or competing with the picture group for whether resources or the right to sell content or whatever they may be. So really significant problems.
So a couple of questions about how companies can do this better, and I'll give a couple of quick examples. So back in the day, before we had the internet, right, newspapers made all their money on classified ads. And like the music business, they looked at this digital wave coming and they said, oh my God, our profit engine is heavily under threat. We better do something. And so what most of them did was they set up a digital division. Very good. Excellent. You're looking at the future. Then what they did was they set up the digital division with its own P&L, right, and its own reward system and its own comp. And they set up the paper division with its own P&L and its own reward system and its own comp. And you got the elephant and the mouse again, right? So it is no surprise that most newspapers really messed up their digital programs. Now, one that didn't is a company called Schibsted. They're based out of Norway. And they were all digital ads. In fact, many of their properties actually were free papers that they gave away. And they made like so much money from advertising. And their senior vice president at the time had a look at this digital thing. And he said, oh my God, the internet is made for classified ads, and classified ads are perfect for the internet. So like the other papers, they set up a digital division, but little tweak here. They said to the people running the physical business and the digital business, look, we don't care where the customer meets us. What we care about is if you guys, you people, keep the customer with Schibsted. That's how you're going to be rewarded. We don't care if it's digital. We don't care if it's analog. We don't care if it's standing on your head and running a circus, right? You're not getting anything unless the customer stays with us. And we're going to measure you on customer penetration versus their total ad spend. It was transformative. Because now everybody's like, okay, we're going to really focus on the customer because that's aligned now with our ambitions. So I would encourage those of you wrestling with this to really, really get down and dirty about your compensation systems and your other reward systems, because this is a huge barrier. We see it all the time. So another fun example of mine is I was working with a big financial services company, and headquarters had put together this sort of boot camp in a box. And they paid for it. They'd done the consulting. They'd delivered the visual materials. And this was beautiful, right? And all that the managing directors who were part of this group I was speaking with had to do was pay for the expenses of having the people at that time, it was before pandemic, but having the people come to this retreat place and do this 3-day workshop. That had to pay for their salaries and their hotel and everything else. And so, that was a morning meeting. We break up for lunch. One of the managing directors looks at me and sort of quietly says, well, that's never happening. And I said, why do you mean? So because the way they calculate my bonus, expenses like that will come out of my margin that gets reported on my personal bonus. And he named an exact number that it would cost him if he sent everybody off to do this boot camp. So, to me, it's just an amazing story about how kind of, the right hand doesn't aid, the right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing, but you're actually incenting behavior you don't want.
Yeah, I mean, largely people do what they're paid to do, which is one of my great simple thoughts for the day.
Can I add a corollary to that, Ron?
Sure.
So a really wise leader at DuPont once said to me, Rita, anytime you see someone doing something, effing stupid in business, chances are they're getting rewarded for it.
Yeah, generally true. So let me see, a couple more questions here. Thoughts on the ideal time frame to complete the experiments as you are in a race to get early feedback? I think it's a great question. You want to talk about checkpoints and,
Sure.
and how they vary from project to project? And sure.
Yeah. So I think shorter is better. The lessons we've learned from the agile movement is 2 week sprints are really good. So if you can get to some kind of result in 2 weeks, that's excellent. There's a great book by my colleague Michael Schrage, which is called something like good ideas are not worth nearly as much as excellent experiments. I have it over on my desk. If anybody's curious, I'll find it for you. But he really goes through, in that book, he goes through a very detailed program of what a good hypothesis is, how to run an experiment, how to do it quickly, how to do it cheaply. So that's the direct answer to your question. Little bit bigger picture is what we've developed in the software that we're building is a series of 20 pre-programmed checkpoints. And so you begin with, let's do some customer interviews, let's get some insight, let's make a prototype, let's do things. So it doesn't force you to do things in any particular order, but it does lay out a program through which you can move. And what we're also building, and I'm super excited about this, is we're building this learning system that goes together with each checkpoint. So imagine you're at this checkpoint called do customer interviews, and you've never done one, or you haven't done one for a long time. You click on over to our learning system and it'll take you through a series of lessons, sort of like what is a customer job to be done might be a lesson. How do you generate a testable hypothesis might be a lesson. What are some do's and don'ts about surveys might be a lesson. And so what you do is you get some knowledge, maybe 45 minutes to an hour's worth, and then you can go back and practice, come back to the learning system whenever you want to. So I think what we're trying to build is a way of building capability that's consistent with this discovery-driven approach, where you, instead of, and I should maybe say a minute about that, because I think this kind of ties in here, Ron. So the whole insight about discovery-driven planning began with stories like this MiniDisc story, corporate flops. I mean, I have a file at home in my office. It's over there. I call it my flops file. You have to lose your parent company at least $50 million to get into my flops file. That's the bar. And I'm going to have to raise it because there's so many more. Like, remember Quibi from last summer? I mean, that lasted, 6 months and consumed $1.5 billion. And I studied these things.
Spend that much money that fast, right?
Right? And I studied these things. And what my colleague and I, who wrote Discovery-Driven Growth, found was this incredibly consistent pattern. Untested assumptions taken as facts, few opportunities for checkpoint, low commitment testing, leaders personally associated with this is going to work and it's going to work my way, and we're not going to look right and we're not going to look left, all the funding upfront. So you got all the money for the whole program right when you started it, typically a big team. So the board says, okay, go with it. And you get this big team, right? And by the time you've got that going, right, and you're out in the market and customers say, this isn't doing what I want, and I don't like this, you don't feel you have permission to redirect. And so one of the hugest reasons you see so many of these bad projects that just take on a life of their own is because they're built wrong, right? The fundamental problem is when you're in a high uncertainty situation. And this is why I'm so excited about these tools now, because like it or not, we're all in a high uncertainty situation. There is no one on the planet who knows what's going to be happening in 6 months or 18 months or 24 months from now. So if you plan it right and you say, I've got a high level of assumptions that I'm making relative to knowledge that I have, and what you're planning to do through these checkpoints is you're reducing your uncertainty. So you can imagine it almost as I'm going from a really high level of assumptions to a much lower level, by which time I've discarded the failed experiments. I've figured out that, they don't like, hey, dude, I've done so much learning. And that's what you want to be rewarding for and managing as you're going into something that's highly uncertain. So you could have killed that thing off very early on, had you gone through some of those initial customer checkpoints. But there is that political overlay, right? Which is, okay, I hear you, I get the message, I just don't like what I'm hearing. and I think there was a question in the chat from Sean, I think, about how do you instrument that kind of reaching out to the edges to make that happen? And there's lots of ways companies do it. A couple of examples are Adobe, which I think is terrific. They have a system they call Kickbox. Anybody in the company can request a Kickbox, and it's a little box with $1,000 gift card in it, and you can do an experiment based on that. At Klockner, they have what they call non-hierarchical communication. So everybody on the company has a common platform. And if the CEO wants to get a message to a guy on the loading dock, you can do that. So there's ways you can actually instrument these things. And I think it's incredibly valuable to make those kinds of investments, because that's where the information often lives. It's not, it doesn't present itself neatly in the, beautifully wood paneled boardroom, right? It's out there where a customer says, well, that was weird. That didn't work for me. That's the data that you want to get.
Yeah. Yeah. So, it's always about changing the slope of the curve, right? So if you think about, you think about this curve, right? So let's pretend this straight blue line here that goes left to right is a standard curve. What checkpoints should do is change the slope of that curve, and therefore accelerate realization of option value. And so Rita, everybody that's on this call we'll invite you to future calls, but we will have one on checkpoints in the Spark process, which I think is I think a lot of people find extremely interesting. There was a question here on size. So Ron, I think I heard you mention size as a problem for innovation. To what extent will size also for Amazon become a problem? In this regard, to what extent will Amazon split up into smaller units, for example, like or higher, in order to stay innovative as they work today? It's interesting. I love there was an old axiom that pre-digital, that companies would get to a certain size, and you obviously the rate of growth has to slow, the rate of your return slow, you become less dynamic. We've seen, so I remember personally arguing this when talking about Walmart in the 90s, saying, well, they're going to get to a certain size, then they're going to level out, and the growth will stop, and they will become like other huge retailers that have come and gone. Well, why hasn't that happened? Well, I think there's a couple of reasons that hasn't happened. First of all, and Rita probably has 10 good reasons. I only have one or two. But first of all, it's the digital age, right? So digital has allowed scale and growth at scale to continue to happen. And the second thing is, I think some of it has, a great deal of it has to do with better management theory, better management education. So leaders like Doug McMillon at Walmart, who I happen to think is maybe the best CEO in America, have taken business and through digital and just very smart business acumen, leverage the core capability of the company. So if you think about Walmart in 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010, it was a logistics monster, and still is today one of the great logistics companies of the world. They move billions of very little things, very low value things, and make money doing it. They've layered on top of that a digital component over the last, call it Doug's administration, last 5 to 7 years, that's taken them to completely the next level. Amazon is kind of the pure digital incarnation of that, and Apple is also a hybrid incarnation of that. While size does limit innovation to some degree because of the complexity, and it does limit growth to some degree because you're absorbing markets without going into new markets. I'm not sure that it is a limiter to innovation. I think Rita has even smarter things to say about that, but very large companies like Amazon, like Walmart, like Costco, which also goes to the edge theory, by the way. Jim Sinegal, who was the guy who built Costco and recently retired as CEO, and Sam Walton and Doug McMillon today live in the stores. They live in the edges, so they see it before other leaders see it. I'll let Rita comment on this as well, because I know she's very well versed in this area.
About the limits of size. Yeah, I think what we're seeing now is, so if I take a typical way that we used to think about organizing innovation, right? And I've got a paper on this on archetypes, right? You start off with, well, maybe we put it in a business unit, maybe we make it its own division, maybe we put it in R&D, maybe we create a senior staff role that makes sure it doesn't get killed, maybe we create an entire new ventures division, maybe it reports to the CEO. Well, one of the interesting things is that typology has now been upended by a further layer of this archetype, which is maybe we use digital to infuse these innovation processes throughout the organization. And one of the phrases I like a lot that gets to this, and this is part of a new book that I'm working on, is permissionless existence. So you've created an infrastructure in your company so people don't have to ask permission. Because, as Bezos himself will tell you, even well-meaning gatekeepers slow you down. And that is such a revolution in the way that we've historically thought about organizing and structuring innovation that I think we're just beginning to see the very weak signals of this becoming widespread. But I think it is a thought worth thinking about, because if you're still, working your way up and down a hierarchy and your competition has learned this new way of working, it's going to be pretty ugly.
Yeah, yeah. But this idea of scale and truly large companies, I mean, inconceivably large companies continuing to innovate at really large scale is a relatively new phenomenon and relatively driven by, I believe, digital innovation and digital leverage.
Mm-hmm.
You certainly saw that throughout the pandemic. The companies that were ready thrived in the pandemic, and the balance scrambled to figure out how to become digitally ready, digitally relevant.
Mm-hmm. Well, and people made assumptions like, I will be able to get laptops for all my call center people. Well, guess what? Your laptops are on 6-month backlog delay. Yeah, that's not going to help you very much.
They're locked down in China and they can't get shipped. So somebody just asked if you're planning to revise your 2009 book with pandemic perspective. I think that's a good question.
It's a great idea. That's actually a terrific idea. I think what's also interesting about all of my books, right, is when I first wrote Discovery-Driven Planning, which was back in 1995, at the time, the reaction of people was, that's so weird. What are you talking about? Because the orthodoxy at the time was, you planned for your whole project and that's how you did things. And it was very unusual to be writing about this. And so I published a book on that in 2000. And by the time the book came out in 2009, people were still just kind of getting their heads around it. Then Lean Startup came along. Everybody started to realize that, there really is a different way of doing things. And so now my next to last book was called The End of Competitive Advantage, about this new way of thinking about strategy. So what I'm hearing now is we really like that we get discovery-driven growth. We understand that now, but this end of competitive advantage, now we're not so sure about that. So I'm kind of like, come check it out in 10 years. But I'd love the opportunity to revise it. I should go talk to Harvard about that, because I think there are some incredibly interesting lessons that we've learned. Among them being, in the pandemic, people were forced to operate that way. They didn't have the luxury to do a long-term plan. They didn't have the, 9 months to polish a board presentation. They had to get moving fast, learn what works, learn what doesn't work, get up to speed. And I'm reminded a little bit of a friend of mine who's in the military. He says, when we get confronted with a crisis, we do all the right things. It's when there's no crisis that all this bureaucracy kind of creeps in. And so I think a lot of companies have done a lot of learning in the pandemic about how you can be more flexible and agile and not, and trust your people and not have to impose all these controls. And actually the world doesn't end.
Yeah. One of the big benefits is you push people into their houses. You had to trust them more because you weren't standing over their shoulder. Mm-hmm. So I want to say thank you to everybody for joining our event. Mm-hmm. We really appreciate your interest. If we can help you, we are out here and available, and would love to talk to you about what's on your on your growth and strategy agenda.
Absolutely. And if you're interested in that, I saw a couple of questions earlier about how do you do that portfolio analysis. We're building a tool that helps you do that, so you can figure out what's in your portfolio. And the critical thing you want there is you need your strategy, which is pulling you forward, your budgets, which anchor you backward, your project selection process, and the process by which people feel they're going to be rewarded to all sync up. And that's what we're trying to help people accomplish. We're building a tool to do that. It's not quite ready for prime time, but if you're interested, drop us a line and we'll get you on the early tools list.